right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our today's afternoon session, which is also the last session of this conference. My name is Stefan Litt. I have the privilege to be the archivist, or one of the archivists in the National Library, and I'm the one who's responsible for many private archives of personalities which have been mentioned yesterday and today, and that may have been the reason why I was invited to be here this very day and to be the chair of the last session. And I'm honored, this is actually the right order. It's Noach, you're the first one, right? So I'm honored to introduce to you Dr. Noach Gerber, who is a research fellow affiliated with the ICOR Da'at HaMakom at the Hebrew University, where he also did his undergraduate and postgraduate work. His Hebrew language monograph, Ourselves, Our Holy Books, The Cultural Discovery of Yemenite Jewry, was published by the Ben Tzvi Institute in 2013, and even won the annual Shazar Prize in Jewish History in 2013, I guess, as well. Currently, Noach is engaged in a project temporarily entitled Reorienting the History of Jewish Orientalism, a study of how Mizrahi Jewish intellectuals employed the methods of Wissenschaft des Judentums in the study of their communities. So, please, Noach, the podium is yours, and enjoy.
You'll give me a best of time.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Many thanks for the kind invitation to participate, extended by Dr. Yoni Mendel and Professor Yifat Weiss. I've learned a lot from all the talks, and I'm sorry I missed lunch, but that's my problem, not yours. Before he discovered the historical Jesus, a young Abraham Geiger made his mark on the converting cognates, to quote Ismar Schorsch's formulation, of the Central European study of Islam and the Wissenschaft des Judentums with a prize-winning essay on the debt owed by Muhammad to the Judaism of his day. To be sure, some have put forward Geiger's youthful essay as a German Jewish and even post-colonial antidote for Edward Said's critique. I take the metaphor of an elephant to being too weak. Some would say he's a snake in the room. Suggesting a tradition of scholarly inquiry untainted by modern colonialism, a uniquely Jewish, perhaps more ethical way of practicing the craft. According to this apologetic narrative, obviously, things get messy when this German Jewish tradition of interpreting Islam is transplanted to a 20th century Middle Eastern setting. In Mandat, Palestine, Geiger's reclaiming of the Jewish Jesus was preached on Mount Scopus with a certain nationalist twist, at times bordering on the chauvinistic, by the Odessa-modeled and Heidelberg-trained Zionist historian Joseph Klausner. Klausner's two-volume Hebrew language monograph on Jesus of Nazareth, first published in 1922, went forth from Zion rather rapidly, being eagerly received in both the German and Anglo-American worlds. Spearheading the German reception of Klausner's tome was a Frankfurt am Main native named Walter Joseph Fischl. Born in 1902, Fischl had received his Jewish education in the dovetailing environs of Franz Rosenzweig's Lehrhaus and at the feet of the city's non-separatist Orthodox rabbi, Nehemiah Anton Nobel. In the latter's circle, Fischl made the acquaintance of a budding Islamist 2 years his senior, Fritz Goitain. While still in Frankfurt, Fischl labored very hard to make post-biblical Judaism a legitimate topic of academic inquiry. To this end, he translated into German both the British Unitarian scholar Robert Travers Herford's monograph, simply entitled The Pharisees, as well as Klausner's Jesus. In the latter case, Fischl was not merely transmitting the Zionist canonization of the Christian Messiah, but also commencing his own lifelong quest as a historian in search of quote-unquote Jewish contributions to other civilizations, both past and present, and straddling East and West. This search in apologetics led Fischl to medieval Islamic orbits, where he explored the business acumen exhibited by Jewish men of affairs in the development of economic and trade systems, probing their political machinations and accounting for their occasional literary activities. Indeed, Fischel rather liberally included in his scope individuals of faint Jewish background, whose fortunes rose and fell with various Islamic empires and political entities. This he did especially after moving to Palestine in 1926, where he was temporarily employed for almost 2 decades by the Institute of Oriental Studies, spearheaded and founded from his native Frankfurt by an old family friend, Professor Joseph Horowitz. Horowitz's father, Marcus Horowitz, had been Noble's predecessor as the much esteemed rabbi of Frankfurt's non-separatist Orthodox community to which Fischel's family belonged. Quite probably, it was Fischel's social scientific background at the feet of Franz Oppenheimer at Goethe University, more so than his own Zionist credentials, that qualified him as a researcher into the social and economic history of Islamic civilizations, a lacuna that Horowitz thought should be filled among the ranks of the junior faculty he was hiring for the Institute in Jerusalem. Enter Judah Leon Magnus, who much more so than the Frankfurt-based Horowitz had a major influence on the institutional crossroads of Fischel's own career. It was Magnus who secured a Lord Plummer Fellowship for Fischel so that the latter could make use of his training in economic history to produce a monograph on the meteoric rise and occasionally brutal downfall of Jewish courtiers and money managers during the classical age of Islam. First published in 1937 under the auspices of the Royal Asiatic Society, it was entitled Jews in the Economic and Political Life of Medieval Islam. However, the analytical categories that Fischel brought to bear on this topic were quite Eurocentric, if not Germanocentric. In 1937, the study of the Hofjew, court Jew in German and Habsburg lands, was only beginning to become a benchmark of the modern Jewish experience. Yet Fischel was already claiming, from Palestine, that the court Jew was not unique to early modern Central Europe, but also relevant to the study of medieval Islam. Portraits of types like Yaqub ibn Kilis, a Jew born in Baghdad around 930, who rose to become the vizier of Fatimid Egypt, betray the author's eagerness to attribute anything positive about the economic strengths of medieval Islamic city-states and empires to some Jewish mercantile prowess that propelled economic and political success. A none too faint echo, in my opinion, of the German Jewish reception of Werner Sombach's theories. While with similar ethnic pride, Fischel described the political doings and historical writings of Rashid al-Din Hamadani, born in the mid-13th century to a family of Persian Jews in the service of the Mongol Khans. A physician by training who had converted to Islam by the time he entered government service, Rashid al-Din also reached the summit of vizier, in addition to writing the official history of his Mongol patrons. His Jewish background would come back to haunt him, ultimately contributing to his brutal downfall, which Fischel described in lamentable terms, bringing to mind the tragic ending of the German court Jew Joseph Suss Oppenheimer, infamously known as Yud Sus. Rather than being guided by a pro-Islamic bias, as many 19th century German Jewish historians had been, it would seem that Fischel had chosen to read the early modern and German Jewish experience back into the past as a heuristic device for interpreting the encounter between Jew and Muslim in the Middle Ages. I think this distinction is important, for one broadly fails to find any genuine appreciation of Islam as either a faith system or culture in Fischel's oeuvre, not to mention any notion of symbiosis, a la Shlomo Dov Goitein, for example, between it and Judaism. When considering the fortunes and misfortunes of Jews in Islamic orbits, Fischel's narrative echoes the historical construction of Jewish history, penned by yet another German Jew. I refer here to Heinrich Gretsch's intertwining account of the history of suffering coupled with the history of learning and scholarship, once famously critiqued by Selo Baron. 20 years spent in the Middle East, not only in Mandat, Palestine, with occasional excursions to the heartland of the region, to Iraq and beyond, did not have much of an impact on Walter Joseph Fischel. He left Jerusalem at the end of the Second World War without having reoriented, and I mean this literally, his understanding of Jewish history. Hardly had he wrestled with the Jewish-Arab question, subtitled for this conference. In 1945, Fischel was sought out by William Popper, today a forgotten name in the annals of both American Jewish studies and the American study of Islam. Popper was Judah Magnus's brother-in-law, and in search of a successor to his post at the University of California, Berkeley. Magnus recommended the industrial Fischel, who accepted. In 1946, Fischel received a tenure a tenured position at Berkeley, something that had eluded him here in Jerusalem. By way of comparison with Gershom Scholem, Arnaldo Momigliano once wrote that Shlomo Dov Goitein was perhaps slow in developing from a conventional Arabist into a student of the Jewish-Arabic symbiosis of the Middle Ages and beyond, quote unquote. To be sure, Goitein was rather elusive in terms of his public persona. During his first visit to Jerusalem, Goitein did what many Jewish pilgrims still do. He visited the Western Wall. More specifically, as he was to recall many years later in a short article in Haaretz on the sanctity of Jerusalem in Islam, he prayed at the wall, at the behest of his aunt back in Germany, Alma Baneth. This is somewhat puzzling, coupled with the fact that his University of Frankfurt Goethe University dissertation had been devoted to the topic of prayer in the Quran. As I recently learned from my colleague, Menashe Anzi, Goitein first encountered a living Arab-Jewish community in the Ard al-Yahud neighborhood of Haifa, but not a Yemenite one, rather a Moroccan one. This encounter yielded little in terms of his intellectual curiosity, for he found the colloquial Judeo-Arabic spoken by these formerly Moroccan Jews to be tainted by Palestinian Arabic to a small extent, and mainly by the Judaismo of the Sephardic community of Palestine. Thus, his dream of finding a pure Semitic speech was shattered for the time being. His discovery of Yemenite Jewry several years later in Jerusalem was timely, and while I don't think he ever articulated this, hardly coincidental. This was in the wake of the 1929 riots, and as Hillel Cohen has so masterfully demonstrated, the Arab Jews of Palestine and beyond were seemingly now forced to choose sides with the Zionist movement in a now fully blown conflict with its Palestinian adversary. While Goitein's initial dream had been to tease out an untainted Ursprache from all the natives of Palestine, politics were now dictating his own research preferences. Thus, I would argue that Goitein's turn to Jewish Yemen in Palestine was hardly only, as he would recall many years later, being intrigued by the most Jewish and most Arab of all Jews. Rather, it was simply that the Jews of Yemen were also a usable surrogate, both politically and ethno-linguistically, filling in for Islam, the Arabs, and Arabic. A domesticated informant, not from the enemy camp, if you will, in the dispute over Palestine, that he could safely work with in his multidisciplinary scholarly laboratory. Goitein's initial encounter with his Yemenite friends in Jerusalem, as he called them, was a linguistic one, which rapidly blossomed into a genuine initiation into their cultural practices. Thus, I should correct Momigliano's rather uncharitable assessment and point out, considering the topic that will be presented after mine, that this conventional Arabist emerged quickly as a full-fledged ethno-linguist and cultural anthropologist. But here again is where politics creep in. For Goitein was now systematically employing the Jews of Yemen, both past and present, as ideal transmission belts between the religion of his own fathers and the one founded by Muhammad. Specifically, he was intrigued by the figure of Ka'b al-Akhbar, an assumed early convert to Islam from Yemen, who supplied his political patron, the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, with Jewish oral traditions concerning the sanctity of the Temple Mount. This was, at the time, politically explosive material, still is, and for some Muslims, Ka'b al-Akhbar remains not only a Yemenite Jew, but also a crypto-Zionist, and or cunning bearer of al-Asriliyat traditions out to corrupt Islam from within. Ka'b was, in fact, a rare academic commodity in Mandat, Palestine, for he had been the topic of Israel Ben Ze'ev, then Wolfenson's own dissertation at Frankfurt. As Aviv Derry Wexler, I learned her name is Wexler as well, demonstrated, Wolfenson's most devastating critic in evaluating Ka'b's legacy was actually Goitein. So I guess this shows that this 7th century Yemenite-born Jew and his legacy were quite coveted by a number of somewhat German Jewish, Ashkenazi-born, Jerusalem, German-trained academics. And it did not stop there. Rather, Literally, Goitein celebrated the Israeliyat traditions in a series of essays which he contributed to the in-house journal of the Hebrew University's Institute of Jewish Studies, Tarbitz. One such essay he entitled Ma Lamad Muhammad Merabotav HaYehudim. This title betrays a certain explicit assumption that in 7th century Arabia, Rabbinic Judaism had enough of a foothold to lay a still uncollected debt at the doorstep of the Prophet of Islam. Although much more implicit, not to mention sophisticated in his formulations than his senior colleague Joseph Klausner concerning the Hebrew-speaking Jesus, Goitein was giving new national meaning to the youthful Geiger's attempt at reclaiming the Prophet of Islam. In fact, one of the last courses Goitein designed for the Hebrew University curriculum was an elective survey for all incoming BA students entitled Muhammad's Islam and subtitled Ketzad Hitavta Dat Chadasha B'Tzel HaYahadut. Around 1950 as well, Goitein was beginning to employ the originally biological concept of symbiosis in order to comprehend the relationship between these two faiths. However, this should not overshadow the very privileged status Judaism had over Islam in Goitein's narrative. The textbook based on this course was first published in 1956, shortly after Israel had secured yet another military victory over its Arab neighbors. I dare imagine what it must have been like for Palestinian Arabs, now under Israeli military rule, to have listened to Goitein literally lay out the debt owed by the religion of the vanquished to the religion of the victors. What had originated as German Jewish intellectual curiosity had evolved on Palestinian soil into a sort of nationalized scholarly competition was now assuming rather rigid state control, and I will elaborate. Of the three musketeers of my lecture, Joachim Wilhelm Hirschberg is the least known because he taught at Bar Ilan University. That's the only reason. But before he got the job at Bar Ilan, he was also quite active in some other spheres. He was actually a last-minute refugee from Hitler's Europe, arriving in the midst of the Holocaust after a stint in Siberia with the children of Tehran. Born in Tarnopol, Austrian Galicia, in 1903, Hirschberg was a product of the Viennese Rabbinical Seminary, coupled with a doctorate from the city's university. He was not alone. Usually people in the context of rabbinical seminaries think of Breslau and Budapest as the two, shall we say, centers of Semitics, more specifically Islam. I would argue that Vienna makes for a somewhat of a trinity of rabbinical seminaries whose pupils did occasionally study Islam. Incidentally, Hirschberg's inaugural publication in rabbinics was co-authored by his chavruta, one Benjamin Mermelstein, recently the movie of the topic of Claude Lanzmann's movie in The Last of the Unjust. In the interwar period, Hirschberg was a pulpit rabbi in Poland, able to dabble in scholarship because he had a patron at the University of Krakow, who himself was an authority on Karaite Judaism, Thaddeus Kowalski. And when he came here, he still had some sort of stipend from the Polish government in exile. And however, he was institutionally on the margins of the academic study of Islam in Jewish Palestine. As the Second World War drew to a close, the Bialik publishing house, perhaps the successor of Dvir, in consultation with Goitein, commissioned Hirschberg with writing a history of Arabian Jewry from the destruction of the Second Temple to the dawn of the Crusades. Hirschberg was surely the man for the job, for he had published 2 previous volumes on the topic during his stay in interwar Poland. He had continued to write in German under the auspices of the Polish Academy of Sciences. In 1931, he published the first, and I believe still unsurpassed, edition of the Diwan of Samuel ibn Adiyah, the almost mythical pre-Islamic Arabian poet, much glorified by interwar Iraqi Jewish intellectuals such as Anwar Shaul. Much of the research done ever since on the politically loaded topic of the Jewish use of classical Arabic preceding the advent of Islam is based on Hirschberg's edition. Hirschberg, and Anwar Shaul for that matter, were not alone. Both Yehuda brothers, Yitzchak Yechezkel and Abraham Shalom, had themselves dealt with the issue of Samuel's Jewishness, specifically in an attempt to wrestle him away from scholarly attempts, like the Lebanese Jesuits Louis Chekos, to prove that Ibn Adiyah was in fact a Christian, not a Jew. This was no mere literary matter. Thus, in putting out a scholarly edition of Ibn Adiyah's verse, Hirschberg, like the Yehuda brothers, was staking out a cultural claim that Jews could compose splendid verse in Arabic independently of and prior to the rise of Islam. On the eve of the German invasion of Poland, Hirschberg completed a second volume, Jüdische und christliche Lehren in und vor frühislamischen Arabien, in which he systematically demonstrated how much Judeo-Christian rather than pagan influence could be brought to bear on the environment which had incubated Islam. The trilogy was completed in 1946 with the publication of Yisrael Ba'arav, a Hebrew language monograph, which I read as an attempt to take the battle between two warring nationalist movements on Palestinian soil back to the Arabian heartland. As Hirschberg would have it, Jewish civilization had thrived, was free to settle, tilt, and cultivate the soil, and even enjoy a period of political sovereignty in the 6th century AD. Complementing the political sphere was the cultural one, where Samuel ibn Adiyah had reached the pinnacle of Arabian poetry in the period of what Muslims call the Jahiliyyah. Revealingly, Hirschberg entitled this chapter, The Poetry of the Jews of Hijaz. Quite a string of quote-unquote Jewish historical accomplishments in the heartland of Arabia, a century before Arabian Jewry itself was vanquished by a rather unoriginal mutation of sorts called Islam. 2 years later, in the wake of the successful Israeli struggle for independence, a now Hebraized, rechristened Chaim Ze'ev Hirschberg was called to service by the first Israeli Minister of Religious Affairs, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon. Hirschberg's responsibility was to account for and revamp the entire Muslim institutional infrastructure remaining in the new Jewish state, reorganize its religious courts, set the limits on the jurisdiction of its state-appointed qadis, determine personal status as well as the reach of Islamic marital law, probe the still very sensitive issue of waqf, or religious endowments, map out and determine the historicity of Muslim holy sites, domesticate a few of those for the use of Mizrahi Jews, mosques and other places of worship, and facilitate independent status for the Druze religion in the new Jewish state. All this demanded the knowledge of a Central European expert, a Viennese-trained rabbi doctor whose professional credentials as an Orientalist were complemented by political loyalty to the right party at the right time. This was the dawn of applied Israeli Orientalism, the era where the intellectual discipline was now dovetailed with state reconnaissance and even military control of an Arab minority. In closing, Hirschberg stood his post until he received his next scholarly calling, North African Jewry. Ironically, just as Shlomo Dov Goitein was putting aside his own interest in matters Yemenite for the sake of the treasures of the Cairo Geniza. But that is a story for another day. Thank you.
All right, now our next and last speaker for this conference will be Dr. Aletta Berhad, who is a senior lecturer at Beit Bell Academic College and the former head of the Israeli Anthropological Association. She studied the development of anthropology in Israel, and her book, In the Company of Other Development of Anthropology in Israel, is lately published in Wayne State University Press. Raphael Patai series in Jewish folklore and anthropology. Orit is also the author of the entry on Raphael Patai in the Encyclopedia of Modern Jewish Culture, and produced recently a short clip on Erich Bauer. Both of them will be, I guess, the heroes of her speech. Yeah. So, please, Orit.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the organizers, Professor Yitzhak Weiss, Professor Miriam Schrinkel, and Dr. Yoni Mendel. In this talk, I will speak about two ethnographers, Erich Bauer and Raphael Patai, the only ethnographers in mandatory Palestine who studied Jewish communities. Professionally, they developed in Central Europe and studied the Oriental Jews in Palestine. Bauer expressed himself in a personal diary and Patai in two autobiographies. Alongside academic publications, these are the sources from which I attempt to learn about ethnography and personal aspects of the main topic of this workshop. Both of them followed the Central European scientific discipline of ethnology, meaning the study of the cultural and social traits of ethnic groups, which is titled nowadays as ethnography or anthropology. In our relevant context, however, anthropology refers to various aspects of human anatomy and physiology. Brouwer combined both the cultural and the racial studies, following the European tradition of his time. Now I would like to present the musketeer, protagonist of the ethnographic story of the Mandat Palestine. The first one is Raphael Patai. He was folklorist, anthropologist, biblical scholar, philologist and historian of Judaism and Middle Eastern religion and culture. He was born in Budapest in 1910 and received his PhD in Semitic languages and literature from the University of Budapest, where he was also ordinated as the Rabbinical Seminary. After immigration to Jerusalem in 1933, he received his second PhD for a comparative study on water in Judaic texts, which is considered to be the first PhD of the Hebrew University. He planned to focus on three main aspects in his ethnographic project in Palestine. First, studying the customs and beliefs of Jews in biblical and Talmudic times. Second, studying the folk life of Oriental Jews and Arabs in contemporary Palestine. And third, creating public interest in preserving Jewish folklore. His main contribution to promote these goals was establishing the Palestine Institute of Folklore and Ethnology, המכון ארץ ישראלי לפולקלור ואתנולוגיה. The institute published in the journal Edot and several books. Edot appears between 1944 and 1947, providing a platform for publications on the folklore and anthropology of Jews and Arabs. This is one of the articles. Patai conducted limited fieldwork, but was extremely fertile during his years in Palestine. He wrote on water, seafaring, soil, wood, and in Jewish sources. He also published articles on Hebrew language and literature. In 1947, after realizing that the Hebrew University had no intention of introducing anthropology or ethnology to its program, he relocated to the United States. He became one of the first scholars to teach anthropology of the Middle East. Patai passed away in 1996. The second is Erich Brouwer. Was born in Berlin in 1895. From childhood, he suffered from physical disabilities, which limited him throughout his life. Brouwer was a talented graphic artist, and after being rejected by the Berlin Art Academy, he turned to ethnology, where he specialized what called the new science of ethnology. He studied in Berlin and in other European universities, including the University of Leipzig, where he completed his dissertation in 1924. The dissertation on the religion of the Herero tribe of Southwest Africa was based on academic texts rather than on fieldwork. The Ethnographic Museum in Leipzig sent him to Palestine in 1925 for a few months in order to collect material on everyday life in Palestinian villages. He returned to Palestine in 1927 and settled in Jerusalem, where he conducted fieldwork on several Jewish groups, mainly on the Jews of Yemen and the Jews of Kurdistan. His book on the Yemenite was published in German by Heidelberg University in 1934. אתה רוצה לקרוא את כמובן? את השם?
No, Peter Yemenitischen Juden. I guess most of the audience may have been able to do that.
It was never translated from Germany. Now we'd like to talk about the fourth. His studies were supported with funds provided by the Hebrew University, but the university did not offer him a sustainable academic position. His scholarship terminated in 1940, and 2 years later he passed away after a short illness. His unfinished Kurdish monograph was taken over by Patay, edited and published in Hebrew and later in English. Now I would like to talk about the ethnographic perspective of the German ethnologists regarding the Oriental Jews and Arabs in mandatory Palestine. In his monographs on Jewish communities, Broward placed special emphasis on what he called the living people, namely on the daily life, beliefs, practices, thought, and routine behavior, contrary to the scholars of Judaic studies who showed interest primarily in the sublime material, such as Judaica and rabbinical literature. He searched for a root of custom in local non-Jewish customs, similar custom in historical society, ancient Jewish custom, and contemporary Jewish custom of other ethnic groups. Broward created meticulous ethnographies based on the description provided by his interviewees and written sources, in attempt to portray their past before their immigration to Palestine. In addition to his ethnographic study, as a routine scientific work, Broward purchased items from his subject, photographed them, measured them, and interviewed them. However, his study almost completely ignores the new reality of their life in Palestine. Today, an obvious harsh criticism is leveled at the ideological and moral aspects of his racialist sciences approach. I would like to show you some. This is one of the most famous two pictures that he showed together, and it says in the book how different the tribes of Israel are from one another. This is a page from his archive of measurement of his interviewees. You can see the name, you can see the rochav, orech, weight, height, and also some measurement of the skull. And here is the colors of the eye, the skin, and the hair. It was very, very common in this Jewish scientific scholar to do that. In his diaries, now I'm talking about the personal diaries that he left, and they are now in the National Library. In his diaries, he tells us little about his feeling toward the people he studied, and in most instances expressed unemotional and naturalistic attitude. He didn't become enthusiastic, nor did he condemn them. In a rare description of the daily life of his diaries, Brauer expressed compassion with moderate degree of aversion. For example, his wandering in Jerusalem took him to Mishkenot Israel neighborhood, and I quote, "In an alley, Yemenites are living in pitiable tin huts. People are feasting around in their shops. They try but fail to make any money. They hang their laundry outside. The women are skinny and unhealthy. There is no sewage system, and they throw the garbage outside." The only reference I found in his diary to the discrimination of Ashkenazim against the Yemenites appears in the following section, and I quote, "In the road to Gania, passing over the Jordan Bridge, we turned by the Yemenite settlement of Kinneret. How the people here live here. In the height above, the communal village is building 3 large apartment buildings that are just like Swiss palace-like hotel. And below they forgot about Yemenites, about which they disseminated so much propaganda." He directed his arrogant and antagonistic feelings not toward the Oriental Jews, but rather toward the Ostjuden, those of East European origin. Here is a brief scene he described in his diary of his neighbors on train journey. "An Ashkenazi woman who sat next to me had a horrible physical appearance with a spongy, expressionless face and elephant legs. We were talking about elephant legs.
Yeah.
Her female neighbor was of completely different nature. She was Sephardic with a charming young boy on her lap, a lively person. And he said, I like the Oriental Jews much more than these dark Eastern Jews. On another occasion, he expressed blatant criticism toward the Ashkenazi Churva synagogue in Jerusalem. He mentioned its poor maintenance, the shocking design, and the prayer's filthy talitut. There is a typical romantic description of his meeting with Oriental Jews and Arabs in public places in Jerusalem, and I quote, in the afternoon I went to the boulevard by way of Jaffa Street. The Oriental Jews were sitting around, the young girls and women in their bright-colored clothing, orange, green, and thrown over that is the silk scarf. Arabs with fez sit in front of the Arab cafe watching the boulevard. And then, surprisingly, he continues of his observation. What do you see for the types of among our Jews, almost Africans? In his personal writing, though not necessarily not public, we know that he kept it in the archive, Brauer expressed in his diaries following Gerber's formulation, a combination of solidarity and empathy with a mixture of romanticism and Orientalism. Now we'll move back to Pater. When he arrived to Palestine, Pater was preoccupied with the question of his Jewish identity and tried to trace his ancestors' origin in what he formulated as a sharing common origin with the Arabs. In a letter he wrote to a friend in Hungary, he wrote, I made friends with people, with Jews and Arabs, and it was as if in all places and in all times I could feel the common race. We are the sons of Shem, and we live here in the land of Shem. In the following paragraph he confessed, from the beginning I felt drawn especially to the Sephardic Jews. I felt that they were my relatives. Then I began to study the traditions of my ancestor and found that my great-grandfather lived in South Hungary, and it is known that the Jews of South Hungary had become up from the Balkans. They are Sephardim. Lo and behold, the blood bubbles up. Taking into account Pater's interest in the Arabs and in Islam, it is small wonder that he chose to study the Morano community of Meshed, Iranian Jews who were forced to convert to the Islam. In the course of his career, he moved between several theories, fields, and interests. In Palestine, the shift from focusing on Jewish folklore to study the Oriental Jews, and later the interest in Arab was quick. In the beginning, Pater was loyal to the method that underscored the unique characteristic of each community in the Middle East separately, including Jewish community that lived in close proximity to Arabs. Later on, he expanded his perspective and made some comparison of Jewish ritual to custom to corresponding ritual in the ancient Near Eastern Africa. For example, in his article, Hebrew installation rites, a contribution to ancient Near Eastern African culture contact. In his writing from his chair in the United States, he related to the Middle East as a distinct and homogeneous cultural space, spanning from North Africa to the center of the Caucasus, in which differences between Jews and non-Jews are blurred. In his autobiography, Pater mentioned his Arabic language study in Breslau University. His Arabic teacher was Karl Brockelman, about whom Pater wrote, and I quote, I was privileged to have been his only student in the Arabic class, which amounted to private instruction by the foremost Arabists of his age. Pater recalled the following anecdote. Breslau University was a Catholic institution. Under Brockelman's initiative, myself the Jew, and Brockelman, the Protestant, used to conduct private lessons on Catholic holidays in Brockelman's office. Upon arriving to Palestine, Patai's encounter with Arabs in Jerusalem was mediated by his friendship with Ahmed Kinani, a resident of Wadi Joz. אני שכחתי להראות לכם עוד, I forgot to show you another slide of what Patai did. He used to photograph his interviewees in like what we know now today, like prisoners, you know, before put them in prison. So this is what he wrote under the photographs, the beautiful Persian woman. But there are more than 1,400 pictures like this in these interviewees. If you want to see them, they are in the archive of the Museum, Israel Museum of Ethnography. This is this is also a page from Brauer diary he wrote, and in German, of course, and also used page. Okay, this is Patai and Kinani in Hebron, the upper photograph. Patai preoccupied and Patai appreciated and assisted of Kinani in learning about everyday Arab customs, such as how to smoke nargila and how to greet people in Arabic. Together with Kinani, visited Hebron and other locations near Jerusalem. During the night of the Ramadan, he said, he sat with him in the street of old city, in cafes, speaking to people, listening to storytellers, and watching the street performances. His attitude toward Arabic was deeply emotional, romantic, and mixed with high regard for his richness. For example, in the description of a visit to the home of one of the distinguished Palestinian families, he remembered, and I quote, "My initial enthusiastic and romantic recreation of the first encounter with the later hires of the great old Arab culture." Patai concluded, "All in all, there was much that I liked in Arab world with which I got acquainted after my arrival in Jerusalem. As I advanced in understanding the Arabic and the script, I began to appreciate the flavor of that idiom, the richness of the folklore that colored the many proverbs and sayings, and the elaborate and pithy expressions that sprang to lips of even the most undereducated. His mastering of Arabic and Hebrew was good to the degree that he taught both languages in a Jewish school." Now, later on, under the influence of American anthropological studies of acculturation, he published a paper on cultural contact between Arabs and Jews in daily life in what he titled as Modern Palestine. It appears at first in Hebrew in a dot, and later in English in a prominent anthropological journal, which was addressed mainly to the American anthropologists. Patai compared the Palestinian context mainly with the colonial encounter between European and Africans in Africa, in order to refer to theories of cultural encounters of his time. Contrary to the accepted argument about the change of the low culture and the impact of higher and dominant culture as an outcome of the encounter, Patai argued that acculturation in Palestine was the result of reciprocal influences of three different present communities: Arab, European Jews, and Oriental Jews. The latter play a minor role in his article. The changes took place in the sphere of economics following shared dependency, production and commerce, and the embracing of innovative technologies, first by the Jewish farmers and followed by the Arabs. The Jews, Patai stated, were involved in agriculture as a result of their ideology, while the Arabs sought exit routes to escape from it. Administrative employees and clerks, farmers and industrial workers, experts and laborers, merchants and academics, as well as leisure class, all were members of both communities. In older cities, the contacts between Jews and Arabs were more frequent than the encounter between Jews and Arabs in separate rural communities. As long as the Ashkenazi Jews immigrated in small numbers, he said, they acclimatized to the culture of the Sephardic Jews of the old Yishuv, whose way of life was similar to other cities in the Ottoman Empire. But gradually, the Sephardic Jews adopted Ashkenazi culture and aspired to become like them. On the subject of Arabic language, the main topic of this workshop, Patai stated that the Jews and Arabs studied each other's language. The Arab study, the Hebrew, was informal, while Arabic was a compulsory subject in Jewish schools. However, and I quote, the incentive in this case was mostly economic, less often social, and very rarely cultural proper. I would like to note that in his paper, Patai did not specify the sources of the data he presented in the following diagram, which may very much will be of interest to you, but it might be a vision of how he sees the future study than presenting the reality. So this is diagram I found in the article. I'm not sure it's data-based, anyhow. Additional statements regarding the cultural encounter between the communities related to the Oriental mood, and I quote, still deeper went the influence of the Orient when it made itself felt in a subtle but perceptible change in the outlook of life of the European Jewish immigrants, what is usually called Oriental phlegmatism, showed its first sign also in the midst of the European Jews settled in the town. Here we can find the seeds of Patai's adoption of the culture and personality school, which he will express later when he wrote the two books, The Arab Mind and the Jewish Mind. Patai and Brouwer hold a similar ethnographic gaze, which derive from their direct and indirect statements regarding the role of ethnologists and anthropologists. Brouwer and Patai offer an ethnographic view of Oriental Jews and Arabs in their academic as well as in personal writings. The perspective is the professional baggage which they carried with them when they emigrated from Central Europe to Palestine, where they continued their academic and research career. They were guided by a combination of a national motivation, scientific curiosity, and romantic attitude toward the Orient. Patai viewed it from above and as a broad canvas. He attempted to scrutinize steps, trends, and characteristics for what he perceived as culture. He began as a scholar of text and later wandered between periods and places, described all in papers and books. I would like to show you a short selection, short because I had 17 books of his work. Now I would like to summarize. While Patai formulated a vision and outlines for proper ethnographic study in his armchair in his office, Brouwer left his home in the elegant New Jerusalem quarter of Rehavia every morning and went off to the different Jerusalem quarter to meet with his interviewees. They both felt rejected by the academic establishment. The attempt to convince the university to establish chairs for teaching and studying ethnology, at least Jewish ethnology, was received by polite refusal, despite numerous statements made by the leading members of the Hebrew University pointing to the importance of the field. They did not leave behind an intellectual heritage or students. Patai pursued a career in the United States and became an expert on Middle Eastern culture and society. Brouwer, who aspired unsuccessfully to become, in his word, when he was talking to Goitain 2 days before he died, I will be the ethnologist of the Jewish people, came into the public eye only 60 years after his death.
great. And thanks to both of you for the perfect discipline of timekeeping. And that leaves us plenty of time right now for discussions. So please, the floor is open.
Thank you very much for both of fascinating papers. Noach, I wanted to ask you regarding Goitans and the Yemenites. I mean, if I got you right, you have this. You actually don't take his words like his later words, a description of this most Jewish and most Arabs of all,
Right.
etc. Regarding the Yemenites.
Partially because of discussions we've had.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, just.
I mean, you said for him they were like domesticated implements.
Or I called them even a surrogate, like sort of like they could be a stand-in for taking Yoni Mendel's. And I do think the dichotomy is relevant here between a stand-in for the enemy, in the sense that I think Goitein, his relationship to Brit Shalom is something I don't want to even get into, but I think it is for good reason that around 1930-31 we begin to see his string of publications on his linguistic interviews of Yemenite Jews. And it's not that he wants to get like in a sense, a more genuine Arabic out of them and a more genuine Hebrew out of them. But I think that the political situation has something to do with it.
Yes, absolutely. But the question is, what kind of relations existed between this like different interests? Because I mean, still, I couldn't find any smoking gun, so to speak.
No, neither could I.
And I mean, also in his early, I mean, contemporary. When he actually writes about the Yemenite accent, he has an interest with reviving the Hebrew accent, the way people should talk, for example. All kind of things that I cannot see them through the prism of know the enemy. I mean, it hasn't.
I don't think it's an exclusive explanation. I certainly don't think it's an exclusive explanation, but I do think it should be taken into account, because it's not that he gets off the boat and decides, wow, look at these, most Arab. He goes through some trial and error experiments. I believe Brouwer also started with the Bukharin community and had a bit of a disappointment. Mm-hmm. And then...
they rejected him.
They rejected him.
They were too rich and too arrogant for him.
And yet when Ephraim Moses Lillian fell in love with them, the Yemenites wouldn't show him their women, and he wanted to paint women, and each to his own. But I do think that the timing of the turn to the Yemenite Jews, it can't be a coincidence that it starts after 29, after a certain sort of Rubicon has been crossed, and there's no return. I don't think I can prove it, but I thought it's worth mentioning.
I'm not sure that it has to be checked again, but
to be sure.
The 30s was still, in a way, I don't want to speak about the Arab Jew now, but at least it was, in the eyes of several scholars, it was still an open, in a way, opportunity to...
Not for the Jews of Yemen. They had made up their mind before 1929 with their, I think, political loyalties. I don't think it had much to do with the Jews of Yemen, but it had something to do with this sort of Ursprache that could be teased out from the natives of Palestine. And I think perhaps Professor Horowitz's memorandum might have, given Goitein some sort of inspiration, but that in 1929, in the aftermath, he had to make a certain choice. And perhaps the Yemenite Jew was his way of being able to include the Arabic and the Hebrew in one entity, which so happened to be of the right camp. That's just a, and but again, I don't think it's an exclusive explanation by no means.
I think, another question to Orit, you mentioned Fatai's attitude, at least the early attitude towards the Arabs of Palestine, and I was wondering, because you mentioned his later books such as
The Arab Mind.
I was wondering how actually this Orientalistic, in a very bad manner, book corresponds with his early impressions.
I do not have any explanation for that. I know what is the damage this book did, you know, as a yeah. It was.
I mean, also today, some people actually use
Yeah,
this book
yeah,
as
the American army used it as a Bible. Yeah, yeah.
It was reprinted.
When the invasion to Iraq.
Investigating.
Yes, for the Abu Ghraib prison. There was a short article of Simon Hirsch, the journalist in the New Yorker. He blamed Patay, his book, 30 years after the book was published, being the Bible of the intelligent American intelligence. So, but I don't know. I don't know. I have a guess. I didn't study his books.
This is his last book, The Arab Mind?
No. He had later had Jewish mind. I never worked with him. Yeah, really. And
Still to be used.
yeah. And the myth of Jewish race also. So Patay was a very interesting figure.
and two autobiographies.
And two? Yeah. Cool.
First, if Yat, please.
So maybe to start with now, and thank you both of you, and while you spoke about Hartelion in Haifa, and I was thinking about 1929 in Haifa, which is less known, but even in Haifa in 1929, the communities, so to say, separated in a way, and all kinds of ideas of living together change very radically. So, and I was thinking about a moment where, on the one hand, the need for know the enemy is higher, but the ability is lower, which means once you really have to learn your enemy, you cannot do it anymore because you are not mixed anymore. So once it's an enemy, it's you have to turn inside because you cannot or not in the way you did it in the past. So I thought that it is extremely interesting. And to it, I do have a general question, and because you already brought now in your answer the word race. I mean, it's a racial studies.
Right.
And everyone who worked or was interested in all kinds of racial studies knows that in the field of racial studies you have, so to say, the state of the art, of the art of every generation, the state of the art of the 19th century, and the state of the art of finance and the state of. So I wonder, I mean, of course it's always weird and funny, and we look at these two pictures, the black and the white, the Germania Yehudia, by the way, interesting. Germania Yehudia, not. And I wonder how you deal with it. I mean, with the fact that it was nothing special in the sense that it was the way it was done. Inside.
Myself, how I deal with it?
Yes, of course.
Should I say I condemn it?
In 100 years we will be ridiculous as well. I mean, I'm always aware to the fact that in 100 years we will be read as very ridiculous people. That's the way science works, and that's the way progress. So, how to deal with it? Your awareness vis-a-vis your materials.
I'll tell you. Yesterday I was in the Anthropological Association conference, and I was talking about Brauer and Patay about two ethical dilemmas that we have. One is the responsibility of the anthropologist of what misuse people will do with his writings about Patay and the Arab mind. And the second is a קריאה לאחור. How do you say it nice in
I would say teleology.
Teleology, okay. How would we
Projecting.
projecting our view now to the past? It should be noticed that years after we will pass away, people will look at our misunderstanding or what to say, and
use them in the appropriate security establishment.
But I would like to mention one thing. Although Patay picture and photographs and measured his interview, he never used it in the monographs. He never connected the history, culture, society with the physics. And Rupin also did. I know that you worked on Rupin, right? So it was two separate fields of study, which Rupin and Bauer never, as far as I know, never intertwined together. When he wrote about the Kurdish Jews, he never put any measurement inside or photographs. Maybe it was too expensive to put photographs book, but he didn't use it. So studying the measure, it's one thing, photographing second, and to describe the history and culture of the people is a different practice.
Okay, we have to react still to Ifat's question.
Oh, so I just wanted to remark, response to your remark about Haifa, Shmuel ben Shabbat, who was one of the leaders of this Mugrabi community that Goitain was so disappointed with. He's a Moroccan Jew who's an authority on Judeo-Spanish folklore, which makes it a bit complicated. He writes a lot of Mizrach Ma'arav. He's one of the leaders of the Mizrahi party in Haifa, and he coins the term folklore Yehudi Aravi. Now, this man loses his son in 48, who happens to be killed together with Yitzchak ben Zvi's son, probably by friendly fire. This is his initiation into the cult of the, Mishpachat HaShchol. And then when he passes away in the 50s, they publish a whole journal in his memory, and they start to retroactively look back at 29 and say, Ben Shabbat was the first person who said that we have to accompany the Jewish school children to and from school and from the Nial Dal Yahud because stones are beginning to be thrown. Now I wonder, based on your remark, if that is something that is teleology or just retroactively thrown back, or perhaps the relationship between Jews and Arabs in what we call in Hebrew muvlaot oni were already beginning to deteriorate already in the 20s and certainly in the 30s. I know about the Yemenite community, Shiloach, for example, with all the mythology that's currently, loaded on that. I wonder how to interpret the Hespedim about Ben Shabbat going back, and this is a man, again, who believes in folklore. He's the one who's, coined the term. It just makes it very perplexing, that's all.
There was a question before.
Yes, it's really not a question, it's a comment. It's a follow-up to what Ori just said. I think one should put in a word in defense of Patai in the sense that if one of his books is being used by the American CIA or military intelligence, that is not the criterion for judging the scientific quality of the book, because every book can be misused. And it probably has been misused. Of course, it's a very controversial work. And there are many scholars who say that he either exaggerated or saw things in black and white. My view is not quite like that. I think there are many valid points in that book. There may be some points which are not. But that does not mean the whole book is worthless or not scientific. The other point about the latest book, The Jewish Mind, is that he made a very original discovery in that in the first part of that book, in the introduction actually, the introductory chapter, where he quoted an article of his which was published earlier, where he pointed out that between the destruction of the first temple in the first century and the expulsion from Spain, which was 1400 years later, more than 1400 years, there was no chronological Jewish historiography. In other words, that the Jews telescoped events from different times and lived in a kind of atemporal world, a kind of living in fantasy or in the past over 14 centuries, which was a point that Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi later on picked up in his study Zachor. So I think one should give him credit for some original ideas and research which were his, really.
Thank you.
Yes, Yael, please.
Oh, just one small anecdote. There's an amazing woman. She's 84, and she grew up in the Moroccan neighborhood, and she goes back a few generations back. And she reports of a very neighborly relationship up to a point.
To a point.
Yes, but she was born post 29.
Post 29. Interesting.
And she has a very interesting story to tell. And
interesting.
Like,
Yes, please.
How would you explain almost total exclusion of both of them, and especially of Brower, I think, by the Israeli Academy? Is it a matter of discipline?
I had a note for my summary that maybe they disappeared because they were not good enough. Maybe. I don't know. My biography that I started to study anthropology at the beginning of the 70s. I didn't even presented by my teacher the book of Jews of Kurdistan in Hebrew, or the introduction to anthropology in Hebrew that Patai published in 1947. My teacher taught me what they study in the United States or in England. So, and nobody knew about these books. And I asked my teachers, did you know about the book? No, I never know about it. So when I read it now, I might have an explanation because they might be not good enough to study anthropology according to the introduction to anthropology. But Jews of Kurdistan and Jews of Yemenite Jews, I cannot read because I cannot read German, might be not very bad basic book for knowledge about these communities. You know that now there is a translation of the Jews of Kurdistan into to Turkish by a Kurdish press. Yes, I think it's one of the revivals of the Kurdish identity.
Thank you, both of you. Very, very interesting. Just wanted to go back for a second to Goitain again and to say that it's unfortunate that Hagit Lavsky had to leave because
the daughter of Plessner.
The daughter of
Right?
Plessner, yes, of course. Sorry. Because it's quite interesting. Again, going back to what Hanan said, what you said about 1929. Well, Plessner only came to Israel in 1933, so he never experienced the 1929 kind of crisis as some kind of disillusionment of some sort. He came to a disillusioned society, maybe. So that might help us explain why Goitain changed his research to something else, while Plessner remained practically just focused on the same things from the 1920s until his death.
Can I
Sure.
respond? In 1949, Goitain publishes an essay. This is just around the time they found Chevra Mizrachit Israelit. He is the central person in that. Mizrach HaChadash. This appears, I think, in Molad. Symbioza Yehudit Aravit, it's called. And you think, the guns are barely silent. And here's this German Jewish Orientalist at the Hebrew University. He's now the head of the Machon Madei Mizrach. He's already been in Aden, in the camp there to get as much material as he can. And I'm not saying he doesn't have a heart, but and he writes that the Jews coming now, the Jews coming from Arab lands, the refugees, we call today refugees, they will be the Gesher. Mm-hmm. And you wonder, has he not learned anything? Is this a post-colonial fantasy? Maybe we're all wrong sitting here. I mean, and this is a man, by the way, who had his own, I think, fantasy of becoming the Israeli Minister of Education at some point. And some say that's the reason he left. I don't know. But this is also a person who, in his writings in the 50s, when he writes about Jerusalem during the first Islamic period, when Jerusalem first becomes Arabized, he points out that these Arabs are ethnically from Yemen. So he starts calling it Aliyah Teimanit. Now, Al-Miyat Ha'oved, I find that very elusive and hard. Hanan, I think, will solve the riddle. I gave up a long time ago. But, So that's my response to your remark. Maybe he did truly believe it. Maybe into the 50s as well. I don't have an answer.
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, I would be interested to hear a little bit more about Fischl and his his German environment, his German context, and you mentioned that he wrote against Sombart. So is there
No, he didn't write. I think he was influenced by.
He was influenced, but
Yes.
we have to think about that writing on economics in Islamic countries is a very new topic in this.
And I think that's what attracted him to Horowitz.
Yes, and that's attracted him to Horowitz. But also, you have to remember that Kent Horowitz, for example, wrote his dissertation on Oriental bazaars under the supervision of the other Goitein in Heidelberg. So there is a movement to deal with economics in Islamic countries, and I'm interested to hear how Fischl is fit in this connection, or do you know something about
Well, what I do know is that Fischl's, when he comes here, he sort of like fulfills his chavot, his lip service. He even occasionally helps Horowitz write an article in defense of Brit Shalom. And he does his volume of I think it was the Arab Index or Al-Baduri, I don't remember at the moment. His interest in Jews as sort of the architects of Islamic economic success is so not in between the lines. It's so blatant that it makes for very unsophisticated reading. And today, the fact that he's willing to basically attribute Al-Azhar, founding of a central, to some Jewish mind that happened to become Muslim, but that was for reasons of opportunity. I wonder if he's thinking of Heine, for example. And then when he's here in the Middle East, he goes off and discovers the Kurdish Jews, the Mashhadi Jews. He discovers the whole issue of Judeo-Persian Bible translations. And he finds that there was a Bukharan rabbi who translated the whole Bible into Judeo-Persian. And he says, this is the Moses Mendelssohn of the East. And about his background in Germany, I confess, I think he was much more interested while still in Germany in sort of making sure that rabbinic Judaism was a respected topic. And that's why he's so busy translating these books. It's interesting that he translates Klausner into German very, very quickly and creates something of a stir, not like in the United States, not like in England. But, and I think he sort of abandons that, but he's not really interested in Islamic history. He's just interested in teasing out as many Jewish money managers, courtiers, men of power behind the scenes. And then when he goes to the United States, he starts writing about how British intelligence in Afghanistan and India found all these Jewish agents willing to work with them, and that's basically how the British conquered India, if you will. It's sort of not very sophisticated. I apologize if I'm being uncharitable.
Any more questions or remarks? So then I think we did this session, and we did it at all. And thanks to both of you again. I very much enjoyed, and I'm sure all the others too. And thanks to the organizers of the conference.
Thank you very much.
Any closing remarks from your side or from Yoni's side?
Spontaneously, I don't feel anything. I think it was extremely interesting for me. I learned a lot, and I don't know actually what to say more than the feeling that it was for me a kind of synergy. I mean, I thought it's many fields of knowledge, myths, and that's not necessarily the German Orientalism is the only form of Orientalism. We met all kinds of Orientalism. I thought it was interesting. We encounter also of disciplines. Nothing more to add. To thanks again, actually, to Shaul, Anat, and Karen. Miriam and Yoni to thank you all. And Yoni, would you like to say something? And we will contact you, the speakers you will hear. I guess we will be very much interested in so to say, in your contributions. We will have to talk about it and to see what is the proper context and what. But you will hear from us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.